It began as a simple visit next door, just to return a book. But when my neighbor leaned in, her voice soft and trembling, and whispered, "Stay a little longer," I realized this evening was about to change everything between us. I never planned to stay long that evening. It was just a simple visit next door, a quick knock, a polite smile, and a borrowed book I was returning. But sometimes, the smallest steps lead us into moments we never forget. She opened the door before I could even knock twice. My neighbor, elegant, calm, and carrying herself with a kind of grace that never tried too hard. Her hair was loosely tied, a few strands framing her face in a way that made her seem softer, more approachable than usual. "Oh, you didn't have to bring it back so soon," she said, her voice warm but touched with surprise. I shrugged, holding the book out. "I finished it faster than I thought. Couldn't really put it down." Her smile lingered. Not rushed, not casual, lingered. And before I could step back, she tilted her head slightly and added, "Well, since you're here, won't you come in for a moment?" I told myself it would only be a minute. But as soon as I stepped inside, I knew that wasn't true. Her home carried the kind of comfort you only notice when you pause to take it in. The faint smell of chamomile tea drifted from the kitchen, mixing with something faintly floral. Maybe her perfume, maybe the scent that clung naturally to her presence. The evening sun filtered through cream-colored curtains, casting a golden glow across the room, and everything felt warmer than it should have. She motioned toward the table. "Sit, if you'd like. I'll pour some tea." I hesitated, but only for a second. My eyes wandered the room as I sat. Only one teacup out on the counter, a half-read book resting beside it, a vase of fading lilies. There was a quietness here, not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that hinted at how much time she spent alone. When she placed the steaming cup in front of me, her hand brushed mine. Just a second of contact, soft and unintentional, or maybe not, but it was enough to send a quiet current through me. "Thank you," I said, my voice lower than I meant it to be. She smiled again, settling into the chair opposite mine. And though I told myself this was only a short visit, I already knew I wasn't in a hurry to leave. The clock ticked softly on the wall, the golden light deepened around us, and her eyes held mine with a calmness that felt both steady and searching. I couldn't explain it, but in that ordinary moment, with nothing but tea between us, I felt as though something unspoken had begun. At first, our words circled around the kind of harmless chatter neighbors are expected to share. She asked about my work, I mentioned a deadline. I asked about her garden. She spoke of the roses that refused to bloom this year. Polite, easy, safe. But there was something in the way she listened that made every answer feel heavier than it should have. Her gaze didn't just glance. It lingered, as though she wanted to see beyond the words. And when she laughed, the sound was rich, low, but touched with something that made me wonder when she had last laughed like that. She poured more tea without asking, the steam rising between us, and our conversation drifted into more personal corners without either of us noticing. "I used to love traveling," she said, her voice quieter, as though confessing something. "But lately, I find comfort in stillness. The world outside feels too loud sometimes." Her eyes flickered toward the window, where the fading light pressed softly against the glass. For a second, she seemed far away, caught in a memory I couldn't reach. I nodded, careful not to break the fragile openness of her words. "I know what you mean. It's strange. People assume being young means you want constant noise. But sometimes, I think I crave the quiet more than anything." She looked back at me then, and there was something almost searching in her gaze, as if she hadn't expected me to understand. The silence stretched, but not uncomfortably. It was the kind that carried meaning. Her hand rested lightly against the table, and when I reached for my cup, my fingers brushed hers. She didn't pull away. The warmth of her skin lingered in my touch, and though the gesture was small, it felt like the air between us shifted. "You remind me," she said softly, "that there's still honesty in simple conversation. Most people rush past it. They talk, but they don't listen." I swallowed, suddenly aware of the weight in her words. And yet here we are, talking about everything and nothing. But it feels like it matters. Her lips curved into a faint smile. Yes, it does. For a while, we let the conversation move in slow circles. Memories of books we'd loved, fleeting regrets, dreams spoken as though they were fragile enough to break if said too loudly. Each word felt like a thread weaving us closer together. I found myself studying the way her fingers curled around her cup, the way her eyes softened when she spoke about things that mattered. And each time her hand brushed mine as she reached for the teapot, it felt less accidental. The tea grew cooler. The evening deepened. And still, neither of us moved to end it. In the glow of her living room, with laughter fading into quiet confessions, I realized I was no longer just visiting a neighbor. I was being invited, word by word, glance by glance, into something far more intimate. At some point, the flow of our words slowed. It wasn't that we had run out of things to say. It was something else, something heavier, more deliberate. Our voices faded, and suddenly, the room felt filled with a silence that spoke louder than anything we could have said. The clock on her wall ticked steadily, each second falling into the hush between us. Outside, the night had crept closer, and the curtains now glowed faintly with the last breath of daylight. The air seemed to hold its own breath, waiting. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her eyes drifting toward the table, but never quite leaving mine. I could see the faint lines of thought across her brow, the way her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak, but didn't. And in that pause, I became acutely aware of everything else. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room, the delicate creak of her chair as she shifted just an inch closer, the subtle warmth radiating from where her knee brushed against mine beneath the table. It was such a small touch, barely noticeable, and yet it set my chest on fire. I told myself not to read into it. She was older, my neighbor, a woman whose life carried weight and stories I couldn't pretend to fully understand. And yet, the touch wasn't random. She didn't move her leg away. Neither did I. My throat felt dry, though the tea was still warm in front of me. I tried to speak, to break the silence, but the words caught somewhere between my chest and my lips. Instead, I found myself staring at the way her fingers traced absent patterns along the rim of her cup, slow and thoughtful. When her eyes finally lifted to mine again, there was something raw there, something that told me she wasn't as composed as she seemed. Vulnerability flickered, quickly masked by a soft, almost practiced smile. I looked down, searching for safe ground. "It's quiet here," I murmured, my voice lower than I expected. Her reply was soft, almost a whisper. "Too quiet sometimes." The words carried weight. They lingered between us, echoing in the silence that followed. I wanted to reach for her hand, to tell her she wasn't alone, but my own hesitation held me back. What if I crossed a line? What if this moment, fragile and unspoken, shattered under the weight of action? And yet, I didn't move away. I let my knee remain against hers. I let the silence stay, rich and heavy, because somehow it felt more honest than any words could be. Her eyes softened, as though she had heard the things I couldn't say. And in that charged, wordless moment, I realized, sometimes silence doesn't ask to be filled. Sometimes it only asks to be felt. The silence stretched, long enough to feel like its own kind of conversation. I thought she might stand, perhaps excuse herself and bring the evening to a polite close. But instead, she leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the table, her eyes lowered to the untouched teacup in front of her. "You know," she began softly, almost hesitant, "I don't usually let people stay this long." Her voice carried no reproach, no suggestion that I'd overstayed. It was more like a secret slipping out, unguarded. I tilted my head, trying to read the emotion behind her words. "Do you want me to leave?" Her lips curved into the faintest smile, but her eyes betrayed something else, something fragile. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "That's not what I mean." She took a breath, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, her fingers brushing lightly against her neck as though grounding herself. "Most evenings, it's just me. A book, a cup of tea, the quiet. I thought I liked it that way, but sometimes the quiet feels too heavy." There it was, the softness behind her composure, the loneliness she carried but rarely named. I wanted to tell her I understood, that I knew how silence could feel like both comfort and weight. But before I could, her hand moved, resting on the back of my chair, not quite touching me, but close enough for me to feel the warmth of her presence. I turned slightly, and without thinking too much, I laid my hand gently over hers. She stilled. For a moment, neither of us breathed. Her skin was warm beneath my palm, her fingers slender, trembling faintly as though caught between pulling away and holding on. I looked at her then, really looked, and saw the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, quickly masked by a practiced calm. "You don't have to say anything," she murmured, her voice so quiet I almost missed it. I wanted you to know." Her confession wasn't grand, but it didn't need to be. It was enough. I let my thumb brush lightly across her knuckles, the smallest gesture of reassurance. "I'm glad I stayed," I said simply. Her eyes lifted to mine then, and in them I saw something shift. Not boldness, not even certainty, just the relief of being seen, of being allowed to be vulnerable for once. The clock ticked on, the tea cooled, the night deepened, but in that small corner of her living room, time seemed to fold in on itself. Nothing else mattered. Not the difference in our lives, not the outside world, not even the questions that hovered at the edges of my mind. All that mattered was her hand beneath mine, her eyes holding me steady, and the quiet understanding that had begun to grow between us, fragile, but real. Eventually, she slipped her hand free from beneath mine, not in rejection, but with a kind of gentle grace, as though the moment had grown too tender for her to hold on to any longer. She rose from the table, gathering the empty cups, her movements unhurried but careful, as if each step carried a weight she wasn't ready to show. I sat there, watching the sway of her shoulders, the way she paused at the counter longer than she needed to. The quiet settled in again, but now it felt different. Heavier, charged with something neither of us dared to name. I stood to help her, carrying my cup to the sink. She turned just as I reached her, and for a brief second we were too close. So close I caught the faint scent of her perfume, warm and floral, mingling with the steam of the tea. Her eyes lifted to mine, and I saw it there. The hesitation, the longing, the battle between what she wanted and what she thought she should allow. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than before. I nodded, setting the cup down. "For the tea." "For staying," she corrected. And then, after a pause, she added, "Most people don't." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. She turned toward the doorway, her hand resting lightly on the frame as if steadying herself. For a moment, I thought she might send me off with a polite smile, tell me it was getting late. That would have been the reasonable thing, the safe thing. But instead, she lingered. Her gaze flicked back to me, searching, questioning, her lips parting just slightly before she whispered words I'll never forget. "Stay a little longer." The way she said it, it wasn't casual, not a neighborly suggestion to share another cup of tea. It was vulnerable, almost trembling, as though she wasn't entirely sure if she should be asking. My chest tightened. The room seemed to shrink around us, the silence thickening until I could hear nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat. I stepped closer, not enough to close the space entirely, but enough to show I'd heard her, that I understood. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice low, careful. Her eyes softened, her hand tightening on the doorway as if bracing herself. "Yes," she breathed, almost too quietly to hear. And with that, something shifted between us. The evening no longer felt ordinary. It was no longer just a neighborly visit, no longer polite conversation over tea. It had become something fragile, intimate, and full of unspoken promise. I followed her back into the living room, every step slower than the last, as though we were both aware we were crossing into unfamiliar ground. The couch waited, the room bathed now in the soft glow of a single lamp. She gestured for me to sit, and for the first time that night, her composure faltered, just enough for me to glimpse the quiet hope beneath her calm. And I realized she wasn't the only one who didn't want the night to end. I sat beside her on the sofa, leaving just enough space between us to be respectful. But space has a way of shrinking when hearts no longer want it there. She adjusted the cushion, smoothing it with her hand, though I could tell it was only a nervous distraction. Her other hand rested on her lap, fingers curling lightly, as if keeping her own emotions contained. The lamp on the side table cast a soft golden glow, painting the room in warm shadows. Outside, the world was dark, quiet, but in here, the silence carried a weight that neither of us wanted to disturb. I reached for my cup, though I wasn't thirsty anymore. My hand brushed against hers on the armrest, an accidental touch, or maybe not. She didn't move. If anything, her fingers softened, as though she were testing how long the contact could last without words breaking it. Her eyes flicked toward me, a fleeting glance that felt longer than it was. And then, as though the air had made its decision for us, she shifted closer, her shoulder brushing mine. It was such a small thing, a shoulder against a shoulder, but my whole body felt it. We talked a little, but the words were lighter now, small observations, fragments of humor, nothing as heavy as before. And yet, each word carried an intimacy that made the silence between them even more profound. She laughed once, softly, leaning slightly toward me. I could feel her breath against my arm, warm, feather-light. Her hand, resting on her lap, tilted just enough that her fingers grazed my wrist. Slowly, deliberately, she let them stay there, tracing absent circles against my skin. My chest tightened. The contact was gentle, but it felt like a question, one I didn't need to answer with words. Instead, I turned my hand palm up, letting her fingers slip into mine. Her breath caught, the faintest sound, but I heard it. She looked at me then, not with surprise, but with a quiet acceptance, as though this was the moment she had been waiting for without knowing it. We sat like that for a long time, her head eventually tilting just slightly toward me, her temple brushing my shoulder. I stayed perfectly still, not wanting to startle the delicate trust of the gesture. Her perfume lingered in the air, faintly floral, mixing with the warmth of the room. I could feel the steady rhythm of her breathing, the way it slowed the longer she leaned against me, as if my presence allowed her to rest in a way she hadn't in a long while. And though no grand declarations were spoken, something unspoken settled between us, a quiet agreement, a bond sealed not by words, but by closeness. In that small living room, with only the ticking clock and the glow of a single lamp, we weren't just neighbors anymore. We were two people leaning gently into a connection we could no longer ignore. Her head rested lightly on my shoulder, as if it had always belonged there. I didn't dare move, not even to adjust, afraid the moment might vanish if I shifted too suddenly. Instead, I let myself breathe it in. The warmth of her closeness, the faint brush of her hair against my cheek, the way her sigh carried both weariness and relief. The room was wrapped in silence, but it no longer felt heavy. It was a different kind of quiet now, soft, steady, like a blanket draped around us. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask for words because presence alone is enough. I turned my head slightly, not enough for her to notice, just enough to glimpse her face in the low lamplight. Her eyes were closed, lashes resting against her cheeks, her lips parted the faintest bit. Peaceful, vulnerable, trusting. And in that moment, I realized how rare this was. Not just for her, but for me too. To be with someone without pretense, without performance. Just two people finding comfort in each other's company. My hand, still entwined with hers, gave a gentle squeeze. Her fingers responded instinctively, tightening around mine as though she didn't want me to slip away. Outside, the night deepened. Somewhere, a dog barked distantly, and the sound of leaves rustled against the window. But inside, time felt suspended. Every second stretched, unhurried, content to linger. "I can't remember the last time I felt this safe," she whispered suddenly, her voice muffled against my shoulder. Her words sank into me, steady and unshakable. I wanted to say something in return, something that would match the weight of her confession. But the truth was, I felt the same. So instead, I let my thumb brush gently across her hand, a silent answer that carried more sincerity than any words I could have spoken. She tilted her face slightly then, just enough for her cheek to press against my chest. I felt the steady beat of my own heart, and I wondered if she could hear it, if she knew it was racing because of her. We stayed like that, neither of us moving, until finally she whispered, "Thank you for not leaving." I smiled, though she couldn't see it. I wasn't planning to. Her soft laugh trembled against me, and it was the most beautiful sound of the night. No promises were made, no grand declarations exchanged. But in the way her body leaned into mine, in the way our hands stayed linked, I knew something had shifted, quietly, permanently. When I finally rose to leave, it wasn't because the night demanded it, but because we both knew it would return. That this closeness wasn't a fleeting accident, but the beginning of something neither of us could deny. At the door, she touched my arm once more, her fingers warm and lingering. "Good night," she whispered. And in that gentle parting, I understood. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it comes softly, like a neighbor's voice saying, "Stay a little longer." Sparkles, if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more slow burn age gap romance tales. Your support helps me bring more of these heartfelt moments to life.